So how long does it take to go from New York City to Los Angeles? It's not a joke. How long does it take to go from the East Coast to the West Coast of the United States? 7 hours? 9 hours? 70 hours? 7 days? Sure, if you're taking a car, a plane, or a train. I bet none of you thought in terms of taking a covered wagon. Cars, trains, and planes used to be novelties, but now we take these options for granted, not the covered wagon. Here's another question. When is the last time that you heard a rousing and sincere argument for a United States monarchy? Probably never, right? I've certainly never heard it. Democracy used to be an abstract concept, but in 1776 we fought a revolution against the king, and we've had democratic institutions for so long that a return of the king really isn't at play. Now, why is that remotely relevant to a conversation on education? Well, let me ask you this. What's public education? Most of us in the United States hear the term public education and we instinctively picture a traditional neighborhood school. We instinctively picture public education as one thing: schools that are funded, regulated, and exclusively delivered by the state. Yes, our school systems are changing. In the last 25 years, many of our states have passed laws that enable charter schools, tax credits, vouchers. These are constitutionally appropriate mechanisms for funding diverse kinds of schools. So yes, our school systems are being challenged, but over and against the legitimacy of a uniform cultural default, the uniform school system. Now, uniform is kind of an odd word to use when it comes to public education, because we know our schools aren't uniform in terms of their effects. But our school systems were designed to provide a uniform, common experience delivered uniformly by the state. In fact, many of our state constitutions use this term to describe public education. I want to talk just a little bit about how the United States came to have a uniform school system in the first place before I turn to educational pluralism, what it is, and why it matters. So the United States used to not have a uniform school system. We used to fund diverse schools, Catholic schools, Congregationalist schools, Baptist schools, alongside of the more neutral common schools. And in short, these schools reflected the diverse population of the United States. And until well into the 19th century, Americans were reasonably happy with this arrangement. Bracket, Americans who were free to pursue education. Happy with this arrangement. But then something happened in the middle of the 19th century to disrupt that way of doing schools. Millions of Catholic immigrants, millions, came to the United States from the middle of the 19th century, and as normal, they expected and received funding for Catholic schools. Normal, right? But something had changed. Some Catholics was fine. They could be absorbed and schooled, so the story went. But millions of Catholics? This was a threat to the majority culture. The majority culture was Anglo-Saxon and Protestant, and they fundamentally didn't believe that Catholics could become good democratic citizens. Why not? Well, there was this thing about the Pope, loyalty to a foreign power, and the hierarchical nature of Catholic life and worship sat uncomfortably with the individualism that many Protestants had come to identify with democratic culture. So what happened? From the middle of the 19th century until well into the 20th, we had a nativist movement in the United States. This nativist movement was anti-immigrant, it was anti-foreign language, and it was most of all anti-Catholic. So we had such things as states like Oregon making Catholic schools illegal, the Ku Klux Klan firebombing Catholic neighborhoods and churches for decades, and nativist political parties taking over state legislatures and passing bills to defund religious schools. In short, in the decades following the Civil War, our school systems moved from being plural to being uniform. And that, over time, became the cultural default for public education in the United States. Just like planes, trains, and democracy, our cultural norms are inherited from conflicts that occurred a long time ago. That's how culture works. Now, if this conversation were taking place in the Netherlands, and I looked out in the room and I said, "What's public education?" the answers would be quite different. Why is that? Because the Netherlands funds 36 different kinds of schools: Catholic, Jewish Orthodox, Jewish Reform, Islamic, Socialist, Montessori. They also fund what we in the United States would call district schools. State-delivered schools still play an important role. A third of the population attends such schools. The Netherlands school systems, in other words, are plural. This is educational pluralism, a mosaic of schools, mosaic of diverse schools that are all funded, regulated, but not necessarily delivered by the state. Now, the Netherlands is not alone. The list of democracies that funds pluralism is vast. It includes England, Australia, Canada, Sweden, Finland, Denmark, Germany, Italy. In fact, pluralism is the democratic norm around the world. Alberta, Canada even funds homeschooling alongside of Inuit, Jewish, and secular schools. The Australian central government is the #1 funder of independent schools in the country because of those schools' capacity to narrow the academic achievement gaps between high and low-income students. Hong Kong's government funds education, but the schools are delivered by the voluntary sector. Importantly, pluralistic schools include what we would consider district schools. These schools are still important, but they are not sole providers. Educational pluralism does not cast common purpose to the wind. Rather, pluralistic systems hold all schools accountable for academic performance, and some of them even require common curricula. Alberta does, England does, the Netherlands does. Educational pluralism is simply a different way to organize public education. So when you look across the world and think of it in terms of uniformity or pluralism, the United States is an outlier among democracies. We're outliers. So what? So what if we're outliers? We're Americans. We like to be different. We don't mind being different. Why is this a problem? Well, I want to suggest that having a cultural norm of uniformity is a problem for many reasons, but I want to focus on equity. Uniformity as a cultural default is a problem for equity. There are 1,000 different reasons why a particular school may not work for a particular child. It may have to do with the family's religious beliefs. It may have to do with their pedagogical preference. So you like classical book tradition, you like project-based learning, for example. It might have to do with a mismatch with a child's disability or a child's interests. It might have to do with the school size or location. There are 1,000 different reasons why any school might not fit a particular child. But a uniform school system means that the only people who can act on that knowledge are people of means. People with access to wealth can move to a school district they like better. They can enroll their children in private schools. Low-income families don't have those options. Sometimes we hear the argument that if we simply funded district schools at a higher level, they would all be excellent and we wouldn't have to worry about charters and choice. But that really doesn't solve the problem. that schools are not necessarily, the best district school doesn't necessarily work for every child. So uniformity is a problem for equity. Educational pluralism, on the other hand, from design, assumes that families and children are not all alike, and that that's a good thing, that schools will differ in meaningful ways, and that that's a good thing, and that it's our collective responsibility to ensure that all schools are held accountable for academic performance, and that that's a good thing too. Educational pluralism does not solve all the problems that pertain to creating and sustaining a fair and excellent school system. It doesn't solve all the problems, but it comes closer to fairness than a cultural norm of uniformity. So, I'm making the case that educational pluralism is simply a better way to organize and think about public education. It certainly is the democratic norm, and it works for many students all around the world. So what are the odds that educational pluralism could become our default norm in the United States? That one day, uniformity would be replaced by an educational pluralism? The honest answer is, we don't know. I study social movements and how ideas migrate from the margins to the center of culture. And we know that actual change at the level of cultural assumptions is arduous, takes time, sometimes generations, and in short, there are no guarantees about change at the level of culture. Yes, our school systems are changing, being challenged and pushed in many different ways, but this may not touch culture and our default. We don't know. But there are some things that all of us in this room can do right here and right now to make educational pluralism more likely. The first thing is that we can support political compromise. Yes, grand bargains can occur in the United States. The Illinois legislature recently passed a bill that did three things simultaneously: increased funding for district schools, where the need was great, created a new tax credit program so that low-income families could attend private schools, and for quality assurance, all students who participate take the state tests. This is a meaningful compromise, and we need to support and cheerlead for legislators who can get us through the finish line of meaningful political compromise. The second thing we can do is ratchet back the rhetoric. Now, all countries fight about education. Preparing the next generation is so important that we're never going to agree entirely about how it should be done. We're going to disagree, and that's expected and appropriate in a democracy. But if you listen in on the debates about education in the United States, you will hear entire school sectors pitted against one another. Districts against charters, charters against choice, entire quadrants battling for legitimacy. Now, I want to suggest that this is not helpful to our students. We can disagree, but we do not have to demonize one another in the process. Educational pluralism offers us a more generous space. There's really room for all of us. Just as you can walk out of this room and get to Los Angeles by a plane, train, automobile, covered wagon, or pogo stick, there's really no one way to do public education. There's no one way to school. Thank you very much.